today specifically, I want to address the issues of navigating like those hard spots when you know you're about to have a really tough conversation with somebody. Things that I go into when I have really difficult conversations. I always think about these spaces around intimacy or maybe a relationship with your children. I happen to have little ones, so I love sharing with you guys a little bit more about, some of the dicey conversations I have with my teens and how to kind of bridge the gap from control to more supportive type of experiences. So I am right now dealing with my little ones starting to embrace more independence and going off on their own since they're moving out of the nest. And some of the hard conversations we're having is just, kind of preparing for, financial success so that they don't move back in. Of course, it's a big one. Or just even getting the dreams and their goals and aspirations accomplished. They're finally finishing up with school and they're starting to address new elements in life. So the hardest conversation is, money talk, of course. And, it's no different with our children as we start to address some of these little issues that we're struggling with. So when I start working with my kids, I always have to kind of think of their perspective first. I kind of open myself up to understanding the resistance and maybe even some of the fears that come into play when we're starting to deal with, children and their resentments about, becoming an adult. I know a lot of kids are excited to be adults and some actually are kind of more fearful around it. So I start to really kind of assess my belief systems around how they are entering into the adult world. And right now, one of my children they're struggling with, they love their job and they're really doing well at their job and they get great, satisfaction out of it, but it just doesn't make enough money for them to live on their own. And their car is starting to fall apart and there's, life issues that are popping in. So having to have those hard conversations without letting them feel like they're a failure because, he is working, he's having a great, successful job, but it's just not making it. So trying to help him understand the opportunity maybe to find another job or maybe ask for a promotion or let them know that you're interested in trying something more. It's really intense, right? Because they're esteemed by their successes and we want to fill in those voids. And even in our relationships, when we're talking to spouses or maybe just a loved one, we want them to feel like they're not a failure by bringing up some of these things that we're noticing. So setting up the conversation with understanding their feelings before you go into the conversation can actually create a more supportive environment and an opportunity for somebody to really share and want to be there with you in that experience. Oh, I think we've got him. I need to approve. Hold on, guys. I'm sorry. Here we go. We are adding him. Yay. Success. I love it when it's successful. Maybe not. Anyway, as I was saying, it's really difficult to have these hard conversations because sometimes, we have a perception that they may not agree with right now, or maybe they're not ready for the big transition. So we have to recognize, are we providing those environments or are we kind of setting the defeat and sabotage? So I always like to start off before I start having these conversations to kind of take temperature with myself. Where am I coming from? Am I speaking with this big story of lack and trying to make them be different, or am I understanding empathetically with their story and where they're at, and maybe they're feeling lost or confused? And it's really important to some of that. A lot of the times we're going into new spaces that are so uncomfortable that we want to be supported in it. I'm having a hard time adding Steve this morning. Not sure what's going on. Let's see. Okay. I don't know. Steve might be having bad cell today or a bad signal. So I'm not sure what's going on. Steve, I did approve you, so I don't know why it's going. It says it's adding you, but it's not doing that. So I'm going to try it one more time. Sorry, guys. This is the part that drives me a little loopy. So when we start trying to work with that belief that we think we know what's better for them, or we want to help them see it from a perspective that creates an opportunity for them to see it differently. I always ask for permission before I jump right into telling someone, "Hi, how are you? Good
Hi,
morning."
good morning.
I started a little bit because I for some reason couldn't get you to click in. I don't know what was going on
Oh
with
no,
the.
yeah, I saw your invitation and then when I turned it sideways it went away, so it's
Oh,
good,
I'm
just one of those
sorry.
glitches.
Definitely. So I was just sharing with everyone a little bit about my personal experiences of trying to help, someone feel safe in conversation. So I don't know if you were listening in a little bit about that, but basically I was sharing with everyone that I kind of like to invite someone into the conversation before I jump into my perspective and letting them, kind of meet me so they can kind of understand where my mindset is before I start kind of spewing my opinion.
And I did hear parts of that, but I was in and out. But I
Yeah.
think Tamra said we were going to be talking about planning to fail or failing to plan and how we do that emotionally and in our relationships. And I can't tell you how many times either my anger or my attitude or how I come into it has absolutely sabotaged what I was trying to accomplish. And
I agree.
that's the one thing. If she can, yeah, if she can isolate herself and say, "This is what I want. This is how I want to bring you guys in, or this is how I want to bring you into, or this is what I'm going to." Boy, what a blessing that would be. Unfortunately, I think most of us, we find ourselves in the middle of it, and then it's like, how do we extricate ourselves too?
I hear what you're saying, but I think the whole point is to recognize that when you are attached to the outcome and you're so intensely trying to control something, you're automatically going to be in the wrong because it's not your life to control. When you start to recognize that you're more invested in someone actually living their life independently, you can actually try to minimize. And that's the story of resentment right there. When two people are going at it, it's because you're trying to tell them how to be, how to think, how to feel, and that's not your right. That they have their own rights to that. So yeah, I think when we are emotionally invested, and I'm very always emotionally invested in my relationships, especially as I'm sharing with my children. I want them to have a safe place to grow and be independent, but I also have to recognize at some point they have to be adults and they have to grow up. Or if I'm in a relationship, I have to acknowledge that somebody else has feelings about the same issues that I have feelings about. And to have that discernment is a very valuable element. I think that when we start being irresponsible and being angry before we have clarity and we start trying to tell people to be different, we can kind of block an opportunity to understand both sides. And you're right. I think a lot of people go in with, "You're going to hear me, you're going to understand me, you're going to da 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 da." I think that's the point. We come in with such control and dominance, or maybe even a victim, like, "You said to me, you told me," that victim stance, right? Instead of really saying, "Okay, wait a minute, what I heard was," or maybe, from my perspective, I experienced or I felt. And that gives the other person understanding they're just not getting you, or you're bringing them to the same point of understanding. And I think a lot of the times we jump in with both feet trying to shake things up and really try to get our point across without really understanding that we have to let somebody arrive to our stance versus
Yeah,
that.
and again, the only challenge I always have with that is by the time, I mean, it's great, and Tamara's real good at this aspect, and I always try and feel like I'm the other side because Tamara seems to live her life over here, and I'm like, you know, and so I always say, you can think about that all you want. It's like, boy, I got to make sure that I do this. But then when the poo hits the fan, I find myself, and not anymore nearly as much, but I used to find myself, already involved in it. It's like, okay, this is not what it was supposed to go like at all. And you're right, it is. We have a vested interest because most of the time in relationships, either they're going great and we're heard and we can vocalize to each other, or we struggle in our relationships because we're not being heard, we're not hearing them, we're not communicating well. And so what Tamara, I think, is saying is that if you think about what you want before you get involved in it, so if you can, and our minds are so fast sometimes that sometimes it could happen in a second and a half before you say something. So when you're involved in this, you can actually think, what do I really want the outcome to be, and how do I get there? Because if I say this, that's going to create a problem, either an argument or resentment or a stoppage of communication. Because all you got to do is say one or two things wrong and the other person stops hearing you. And that's real vital then, that you have to back up and say, okay,
I'm not,
this is
yeah.
what I heard you.
Right. I'm not
Go ahead.
talking about when you're in the fight. I'm talking about when you're, what I'm talking about here is planning a conversation with somebody that's very difficult. Now, yes, you're right. When you're already in the emotion and you're in the spin, it is very difficult to have discernment. I'm talking about before you're even heated up and you have a situation that you know is going to be difficult for someone else to receive. Like, you know, it's kind of like when you know you're going to be judging someone and you're aware that this is probably not going to settle well. How do you go in with the attachments and recognizing that they're not ready to have the conversation? How do you bring them to that point? So you're right, when you're in a spin and you're invested in them understanding your perspective, yeah, you're right, they're not going to hear you because you're attached. But when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody that brings them to a sense of understanding, you have to set up in understanding, get their perspective first before you go into the conversation, because they're not going to hear you until you understand their side of it. There's a lot of angst and control in the conversation, but I get what you're saying. I totally agree that, you know, when you're in the thick of it and you're already in resistance, you're not going to hear any better than they're going to hear. There's going to be, that's a total block.
So let me ask you the question then. I'm planning on having this conversation with my significant other, right? So let's say it's about jealousy. And so I want to talk to my wife about jealousy and how she overreacts and she's always upset. And if I just glance at someplace else, she gets really. So what do I say to her? You say, we're looking for understanding. She'll probably never come to that understanding, right? So how do I even have that conversation with her?
Not necessarily. It's how you approach the conversation. It's exactly the point. Is like, if you're going in saying you are always acting you're always accusing, you're walking in with accusation, you're right, you're going to beat a brick wall. Absolutely. Because it's an automatic, intuitive, defensive, protective layer that pops up when we're in that space. So the way you would enter that specific scenario is really just about understanding. So when we go into the restaurant and the waitress kind of is overly friendly, what are you experiencing when that happens? What are you hearing that I'm not hearing? What you're creating compassion and empathy around their feelings so they can feel safe to share. Because your perception of jealousy about her behavior could be just her feeling like she's not getting attention, or that there's maybe an opportunity there that you're missing and you're making an interpretation, an assumption that is not clear. So we have to and investigate.
And they say, no, it's not them. It's always you. I can see by how you look at them. I can see how you talk to them that you're attracted to them.
So that is her defined attachments, right? That's the energetic expression of resentment and being ignored. That exact energy is somebody saying, you don't give me any attention. I feel like you give everyone else more attention. There is a sense of themselves that's out of balance in that state. And there are a lot of people you're going to be interacting with, run through in our worlds. We meet people all the time that are, I call them leaky, because they don't have a sense of themselves. They're projecting, right? They're trying to suck you all your energy. They're like little leeches, like we just gobble up all your emotional time and energy. They don't have a sense of balance. And so in a relationship, we have to acknowledge that someone's working through. We're the mirrors, we're the opportunity for them to find themselves again. So we hold a healthy boundary and say, I understand this the way you see it. And truthfully, I've always been an open, outwardly going person. I'm very friendly. You knew this about me. So what part of this does this really create friction for you? Because obviously you thought I was something that I wasn't. This is an opportunity for you to see something different. I, of course, would never say use. I would say, well, when I smile or when I'm sharing or I'm outwardly going, this is a part of who I've always been. So share with me what you make up about that. Is that something that you're saying that I'm changing, or has this always been something? If you're saying it's always been there, then there's a part of our relationship that you're not okay with that you need to address, and I need to help support you through. So how do I do that? And we bridge the gap by actually acknowledging. You're kind of fleshing out the discomfort. Yeah, it's horrible for everyone. It's not fun. But that is important for us to have those uncomfortable conversations, or else it's kind of like not talking about things or ignoring things. They become more amplified because it doesn't just go away by ignoring it. It actually becomes more intense because they're now building up evidence against this big trial, right? So you have to acknowledge these little bumps in the road to help somebody meet you halfway. And the conversations are very emotional, of course. Otherwise, they would be very, that's the whole reason to plan, because if you're running into a conversation where somebody's, you're too friendly, or you're this, or you're that, you're going to take it personal. You're going to like take on ownership that I am too flirtatious, or I am this, or I am that. It's not you, it's her experience of you, but that doesn't make it that's who you are. It's just part of the experience you're having. You may want to check in, say, yeah, am I being overly friendly, and am I making my spouse insecure? Am I doing things that are triggering this belief, or am I really just being me? And if you're really just being you, then there's an issue for them to work through. But if it's really you who's like feeling like you're actually kind of being a little more bubbly and extra playful, maybe there's something that you need to share with that person to help them understand why your behaviors are changing. It may not have anything to do with relationship.
That's real important, that especially if you're entering into a new relationship,
right,
that you talk about those things, that you get that ironed out before you get into a permanent relationship. So that's all part of the starting up too, is planning to have these conversations where you're going to succeed, because you flesh out exactly where that other person is coming from, or how you're making them feel, or how they're feeling about what you do. It gets back to, you can't make anybody feel a certain way, but they will feel a certain way depending on how you do things. And so if you're starting a new relationship, that's important to have conversations, to plan those conversations. When we do our relationship work, I know one of the last ones I really worked hard with was somebody was feeling a certain way, and the guy was giving her all kinds of reasons to feel that way. But that came about because she had made him feel, they'd been almost in a relationship, so they'd lived together a little while, they got out of it, they lived together, and the way she made him feel, he was upset. So he said, well, I'm just going to do this anyway because she's going to make me feel that way. And they never really had that conversation. And when they finally sat down and had the conversation, what they decided was they were not going to be right for each other. And a lot of times that's what you can be madly in love and still not right for each other, right? So you got to have these planned conversations to find out who's your partner and who can work out for you, right?
I think it's important, and also to know who you are before you even get into a relationship. If you're starting to try to like feel yourself through someone else, you'll get very confused very easily. You get obsessed with that person validating stories about yourself, and then you end up getting very lost in all of that. I do think there's a lot to be said when you're specifically talking about relationships, like intimacy. There's a different kind of emotion involved versus the story I was sharing beforehand, before you started, about talking to your children about hard-hitting conversations. The reason I wanted to do this talk is I'm realizing, as I'm going through certain elements of my children leaving the nest, like how I'm preparing them for success is a lot about the way we interact in our everyday life. It's not that you need to control it, but you need to acknowledge the parts of you that are uncomfortable in the experience. Like in a relationship where you're, like I was saying earlier with my children moving on, it's a sense of like, are they going to make it? And anticipation, right? My attachments is that they're going to be successful adults. Their attachments may be just that they want to go to their movies that night, or I don't know, whatever their instant satisfaction is, right? They're not seeing the big picture. So sometimes it's helping, like you were saying, in the relationship, when you don't know yourself and you don't have a true understanding of, and I don't mean like you don't know yourself, like you don't know who you are. I mean like what things make you tripped up and why, and understanding the deep essence of like the patterns of the behaviors that you have. Really understanding that, so when you hit one of your patterns, you can go, okay, wait a minute. No, I'm just having a moment right now where I'm reminding myself of something of my past, and I'm trying to work through it. Just give me a minute. And it's actually happened to me recently, where I was with somebody and I was like, ooh, that really reminded me of something from my past. It has nothing to do with you. Let me just feel through it. I know you're thinking this is so synthetic, but it's true. If you're really aware of your abilities to see where you get tripped up and where you get angry, you can actually stop something from becoming an ugly fight. Because what happened in that situation is I was able to say to the person, I just need a minute to regroup so that I can come, so I can talk again, because I'm really deeply in this anger story. It has nothing to do with this individual. but it tripped it up for me to work through it.
You know, when you said that, again, my wife and I, we're always working through different stuff. Because like I say, when you have a history, it's tough. But I remember her looking at me as we're driving down the road one time, you know, and I tend to give people attitude. In case you don't know this, but sarcasm used to be a huge part of my life. Now it's just a big part of my life. But I used to have, when I wear my glasses, or whether they're sunglasses or not, and she says something that, you know, I just kind of tilt my head and look down at her. And probably did that 8 or 10 times, and I'm not sure. And she finally looked at me and she said, "Don't ever do that to me again." You know, I mean, it was like snap, and I'm just like, what happened there? What just happened? And I could have reacted and said, "Don't tell me what to do," you know, that kind of stuff. And it could have really burst it, but I said, "Okay, tell me what just happened there, because we were doing fine." And then she said, "That's what my ex-husband used to do all the time. He'd tip his glasses down, he'd look at me and make me feel stupid."
Yeah, he's
and
like,
I went,
yeah, that was his way of controlling.
"Oh, see, so I learned because we talked through it, not because we got upset about it, but because it upset her, and I had to find out why. I had to plan a conversation for a few seconds in my head to say, okay, back up from this and share with me why that was a problem, you know? And I've probably done the same thing with her. You know, here's a trigger. Here's my ex-wife used to do and or say and or make me feel like in this situation, and you just did that. And this is how you did it. And if you could not do that again, that would be great. And that's really important to have those conversations, whether they're with your kids or whether it's your partner, because sometimes, especially if you've got an older child and then you've got a younger child, like my kids were 8 years apart. So, you know, you'd have these conversations and then you realize that so many of them almost don't matter. You know, like, that's why so many times the younger children will go, or the older children will go, "You are so much harder on me than you are on them." And the answer is, yeah, I had a lot of learning to do. And that growth makes a difference in how you respond, how you react, and also how you approach and what would normally be an argument. Because I can tell stories that when I was 16, there was a big argument in my family between my sister, me, and it blew up into my mom and dad. And I literally chased my dad into a bedroom. And I say chased, you know, he was like, "I'm done talking about this." And I chased him into the bedroom, cornered him, and then in our argument, I hit him right in the face. I just hit him with all I had right in the face. And my dad, he's like me now, right? He just looked at me. I mean, boy, you hit somebody in the face, you think they're going to fall down, like in TV. And he just looked at me, took a step forward, and pushed me back out into the hallway. But I mean, it's those kind of things that if you look back on it, he really diffused the situation well, right? Just by doing that, rather than screaming, hollering, or throwing his fists up, he just, boom, pushed you away. And that was it. We're done talking about this. But when you have your kids, these also come back into play. So instead of responding, you can now act. Don't react, act. So when my son would get mad at me and start to get in my face, I could really respond with, "You know what? We probably need to take a break here.
Right.
Because you're not getting me and I'm not getting you right at this moment." And then we go back to what Tamra was talking about, which is figuring out how to have this conversation.
Well, you know, it's funny. You bring up this story. I was working with someone, and they were struggling with their child cussing at them. Little 15-year-old, really sweet child.
Little 15-year-old?
15.
15?
Yeah,
Okay.
15. And it's funny.
They're not so little, you know.
It's not so little. Yeah. What happens is so fascinating is they're so sweet, and then all of a sudden they shift on you. You're right, and you're like, "What the heck happened?" And it was really interesting. The mother did an assertive control because the child, it was an out of control situation. And so the mother didn't raise her hand, but she grabbed her daughter by the elbow and escorted her out the door and said, "When you can come back with respect, you know, come back in." Very powerful, impactful statement, right? And it does it's a respect thing. And it is, you know, some people say that's abusive, some people say that's not abusive. At some point we have to teach respect where it's, you know, a contained space. You know, there's a way to assert control. And these times, those kinds of moments where you kind of second guess yourself, it is very important to understand you have to prepare yourself for those kinds of things. Like your father probably never really thought you would ever pop him in the face, right? I mean, those situations you just don't anticipate. But you have to have a sense of, you know, discernment in place and know how, when you are confronted with your rage, how you're going to contain it. You know, like he just did. He pushed you out the door and said, "Okay, I'm not going to deal with this right now." And it's not that you're withholding. This is not a respectful form of communication and respect and love, and it's just not going to happen right now. So I think it's really a profound way, not that I'm encouraging people to lock their children out of the house or, push them away, but to recognize that I know that more violence doesn't equate to solution, or anger, like you were just saying, rage of screaming and elevating the conversation doesn't necessarily equate to success. So I agree with you.
What is it? Yeah, what is it that the only way to deal with hate is with love, and most of us don't get that. And I'm sorry, that's true in really violent or really escalated situations, that if somebody's trying to beat the poo out of you, just saying, hey, I love you isn't going to work. But in most situations, that's really how it works, is if your kids are upset with you, you have to show them love and respect, and then demand that in return. And again, how you deal with it. I remember I worked with a guy across the street from me, lived across the street from me, and our kids were about the same age. And my kid had so much more, quote unquote, respect than his kids showed typically. He was a grade school principal, so I thought he was used to doing discipline, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he came to me one day and he said, his son was 18 years old, and he said, my son is doing this. And then he storms up and he slams the door and locks it. I went, your 18-year-old locks the door so you can't go into his room. He goes, yep. He said, what would you do, Steve? He was asking me, I need your advice. What would you do? Because I know, you handle. I go, it's real simple. You just take the door off the hinges. And he said, what? I went, he lives with you, right? You pay all the bills. He's still this, right? So until he figures out as an adult what he needs to do, like move out and go do his own thing, he still has to live with your rules. And one of the things he'd done is broken several rules and yelled at his mom and all that stuff, as 18-year-olds might do, And so what happened was, as I told him, take the door off, and when the guy figures out how to treat the rest of the house with respect, you'll put the door back on, because until then he doesn't even get privacy. And it was funny, about a month later, he came back over to me and he said, hey, by the way, that worked like a charm. I took the door off, and he came home and he was furious and he was mad, but there was nothing he could do about it except yell in his own room. And finally he got over it and learned how to deal with his anger a little bit so that he could have his door back. I mean, such a simple process.
Yeah, well, that's funny. And that, by the way, can go the other direction too. That same family I was just talking about, the mother did the same thing. The daughter was slamming the door, so she took the door off. It just didn't go very well. But, it climaxed to the next issue. But anyway, it's kind of funny how they're like kind of stepping over each other. But it is interesting. I think there's a lot of, in this day and age, and I hate to say it that way, but today the rules are so different. A lot of our parents feel like their hands are tied. Every time they do something, the child claims, abuse, and it's a real issue. It is a really big problem, and I truly believe the only way to kind of avoid some of these obstacles is to go back to what I was just saying. When you're going to have struggles and confrontation with presenting an issue to someone that darn well they're not going to resist, they're going to resist it, they're going to give you a hard time, you have to prepare. And planning for that kind of success, from my perspective, comes from really understanding your triggers, where you get, where you start to get really, your blood starts to boil. Recognize those moments and go, okay, here's mine, and this is theirs, and how am I going to contain myself when I get to those moments? And it really goes back to understanding somebody else's perspective first, because you neutralize the anger of the other person when you allow the angry person to speak first, or I should say resented person, the person who's kind of in that, maybe they don't want to change their job like I was sharing with you guys earlier, or maybe, there's just some kind of resistance somewhere in the conversation that it's going to happen. So you just kind of neutralize that by asking, how do you feel about that? What would you like? Where would you like it to go? And really inviting someone into the conversation. What were you about to say?
You hit it right on the head. When I teach this kind of stuff, I always teach the only thing you can do is ask questions. They don't want to hear your opinion. They don't want to know what you think. You just did it. You just said, how do you feel about that? What do you think about this? What would you want me to do in this situation? How would you want me to react in this situation? Excuse me, but it's all about having the questions. Sometimes if you want to write them down, have them in front of you so that when you have this conversation, you can say, okay, they told me to prepare for this, so how would you like for me to react in this situation? Or what would you like for me to do in this? And, it's okay to have questions there, because then your kids will go, what the heck is that? What is that? Right? And you go, that's me hoping that you and I can communicate better, and I need to learn how, obviously.
I love you enough to take
That's
the
right.
time to try to change the behavior. I truly, I think a lot of children just want to be supported and not controlled. And a lot of
Oh
us
yeah.
as parents think support equals, telling a kid how to do it, or somebody else. Even in our relationships, we do the same thing. We run around trying to fix each other. There's nothing really broken, but we run around trying to do it anyway. And I think that if we really acknowledge it's their individual life and their choices that they're making, they're learning the experiences of their choices, that you start to kind of pull back and go, okay, it's just a part. Wow, that stinks that that happened. What would you like different, or how would you like that experience to show up different? It's allowing them to be vulnerable with you without judgment. And it is a huge skill to master, because when you do
Oh
that,
yeah.
every relationship in your life will change. And it's so easy to do. All you're doing is literally just asking questions that provide, and I role play a lot with my clients because I feel like it really empowers them, so it feels more natural when they go into it. So a lot of the times, I'll say, when something, like I have to pick up my daughter from the hospital, I know she's going to be angry and da 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 da. What do I say? What do I do? How do I navigate that? Literally, we role play it. We sit there and go, well, I personally believe in a space like that, sometimes nothing being said is more powerful. Instead of you saying, well, how was it in the hospital? What did you think? What did you do? What did you learn? That's filling with noise. Sometimes it's silence that is so impactful at that moment.
Oh yeah.
Allowing someone to convey and share with you versus you asking and filling the void of silence with whatever. Because it's really just a showing of your insecurity. It's a pop-up of your desire to get out of the discomfort and control the issues. And it really does kind of accentuate the energy. It really pushes people in a corner because they start feeling the discomfort and the insecurity, and they make it about them. And so one of the funniest things about emotions that I've found is that there will be an energy in the room that's just like icky and kind of sticky and like, I don't know how else to describe it other than just really prickly. And you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. And it's like you're trying to navigate it and you're like, did I say something? Did I do something? Did I fart? What happened? Right? And I just start to recognize what is the situation, right? You make it about you. It's so natural for us to do that. And we get so invested. And then when the other person tells us what it was, we make it about us instantaneously. And it may not even be anything about us. Well, I won't do that again. Or no, it wasn't about that. Like my experience I was sharing with you before about, when I had this moment, somebody did something and it popped me right into a story from my past. And I was like, whoa, I guess that's not healed. I mean, it stopped me in my tracks, right? You're just like, wow, where'd that come from? And I really had to realize that the gift was the person triggered it so that I could work through it. And so a lot of the times, I don't think we give it credit. Well, don't do that. That makes me angry. Like, the whole looking over your glasses, you're just listening intensely. That's an intentional listen thing, but it's also used for scolding. And so it could be your way of listening carefully. Like, what are you saying? What are you thinking? What are you doing? And she's hearing, don't do that. So it's an opportunity for her to heal from the perception of when somebody does something, it's not necessarily what she makes up in her mind. And it can break the pattern. So I think if we get ourselves into a space where we can see that the reality of an experience isn't really what it is, it's just a belief that we have within us, that our desires to control the situation. And we usually play small. We usually make it personal so that we can shrink and minimize instead of asking powerful questions like, oh, how funny. When you look over your glasses like that, it reminds me of my ex-husband and how he used to discipline me. And you'd be like, whoa, that'd be like, holy cow, that's intense. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That's uncomfortable. That makes me uncomfortable. Then all of a sudden it disappears, right? It just kind of oblivious, it just kind of melts away. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about communication, connection and relationships, is because so often we drop landmines in our relationships without even getting a chance to really like understand the other person's perspective. We'll talk before we educate. And we walk in with assumptions, and
that's really critical. I'm putting on a little workshop here in Tampa in March, and some of the things that we are going to be talking about are exactly what you just covered, which is finding out what triggered you, finding out what upsets you and why. Right? Those are so important that if you could just sit down right now and write down 5 of the things that upset you about something that in the past, right? what do you still think about? What still triggers you? Why do you, like last time you had an argument with somebody, I don't care who it was, somebody at work, one of your kids, your significant other, the guy who was putting in your refrigerator. I mean, I don't care. The fact that you got upset with somebody, ask yourself that question of why? What upset me about that? And what can I look back in that says, wow, I had no idea that was even still bothering me. And
Right.
that's, that's a really good point, because when you find out that something still bothers you, then you have to ask the question of, I wonder why that still bothers me even after all this time, because you haven't resolved something. You still got something sitting out here that you need to deal with. And Tamra's real good on that in terms of digging that out and finding a solution to help you find that information. And that's critical to us evolving in our lives and moving on to better relationships, no matter where that relationship is, and finding out how to communicate better, right?
Yeah, the key of discernment, learning discernment is a very hard thing, because we have to actually get into play and do it. And that's why I always say life's a playground, get messy, because the whole point to learning things is to get out there, and you can role play these things in your mind all you want. The truth is, until you actually use them, they don't become second nature to us. And so we will, continue to have relationships that are destructive until we take ownership of the parts that we participate in. And a lot of the times when we're in that whole concept of, gosh, I know I have to have this conversation, I'm going to sit my daughter down or my son down or my spouse down, and we're going to bang this out. We're going to figure this out. Meanwhile, they're like, oh, let's go to the concert, or let's do you're not on the same page. You're planning to fail. You're not allowing someone to meet you and arrive to a topic that may be intense, or maybe, something's bothering you, but they forgot it and let it go a long time ago. That's on you. That's on you in a way to present it that helps them understand why you're still struggling with it. Or, I remember in the past, I would, try to, when I was first learning a real solid sense of discernment, I would bring up topics and they're like, gosh, you just hold grudges. I'm like, I'm actually, that's kind of interesting. I said, well, thank you for sharing that. I'm actually not angry. I'm asking you what your experience was, because I'm trying to understand the other perspective so that I can make peace with the part where I hurt you. And I am not angry, and I'm not holding a grudge. I'm actually learning from you, and you're just a great teacher. And the only person I have to ask is you. So if you're interested in sharing with me your perspective, then I can understand you better. If you don't, then I guess I'm stuck with making my own assumptions, which we all know when you assume makes an ass out of you and me. So, so I know it's really an intense experience, but to play with some of that, it's really fun to kind of walk through those things. I really like to kind of get somebody else's perspective so that I can grow, because my intention is always to understand the other element and the other experience so that I can kind of be well-rounded, if that makes sense.
It does, and here's what you find quite often too, is that the other people don't necessarily, may not know how to share. They also may not want to share. So
Right.
the fact that you ask them questions makes them uncomfortable too.
That's
They're like, I don't want to talk about it. Right? I don't want to talk about it, drop it. And you're like, and you want to go, no, I don't want to drop it. I want to find out no, don't do it, right? Always listen and hear that other person. Maybe one day they'll be ready to share that with you, but not right now, whatever that might be. And so part of the key in order to plan ahead is also planning on stopping, right?
Yeah.
So you plan this wonderful conversation, and when it doesn't go your way, you have to go, okay, that's all the farther we can go this time.
Or maybe just understand or maybe just understand they're not open to receiving more information, or the judgments. They're like, I always think of Charlie Brown, when a parent's talking, wah, 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 that whole, that's all maybe they're hearing. And when you recognize they're not hearing anything else, you really should shut your yapper, because they're not going to connect to you. They're not going to understand. They're going to build up more anger, more resentment. And I love this feeling. I had a client who never asked permission to share how she felt. So what ended up happening is she ended up having children who told her that she was selfish. And it's funny as heck, because the truth, not funny, haha, but funny how we think we're being vulnerable. And yet, because she didn't ask permission to be vulnerable, it came across as selfish. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, is when you said, well, I feel that that's not the point. The point was to ask permission. Can I share with you how I'm feeling about that? Because really, I want to get in a better place for both of us. And I'm feeling like we're missing each other because I'm not understanding your feelings, you're not understanding mine. Maybe you can share with me yours and then I can share mine. That neutralizes that selfish behavior. And I think a lot of us get called narcissistic because of that element. I think that's one of the biggest elements around narcissism.
I think Tamra's been called a narcissist. What do you guys think?
No, I have not. Thank God. I'm not to my face.
But yeah, that's really important. That's really important that, and she said something important again there. It was you share with, this is what I'm feeling. And sometimes you have to change that. This is what I'm hearing. Yes. Right? Yes. And remember that we talk to people in a manner that they need to listen. So there's all kinds of different ways. There's I'm feeling this. When I look at this, when I hear this, those are all three different modes of conveying a message to somebody. So if somebody says, you know, deep in my heart, I feel like this, and then you start going, well, this is how I see it. You're actually talking in a different language. You're talking in how you're seeing things, you know, as opposed to how you're feeling things. And those people won't necessarily relate. So always listen to the person across from you and see how they're communicating. Those are all vital aspects. And that's what it might behoove you to go out and buy a couple communication books, you know, just pick up a couple that are really good books on how to communicate and see if you can learn 2, 3, 4 things that'll just absolutely change your life.
You know, and also I think to wrap it up, I think it's also even important to acknowledge that if you're struggling and learning this type of discernment or these communication skills, to let somebody know and say, hey, I'm going to try this from a different angle, or, you know, I may mess this up, but I'm going to try this. You know, asking permission to be sloppy, people have empathy and compassion around learning, and they love to support somebody who's trying something different. They kind of love the underdog, right? So we want to like invite them into the experience. And I remember when I was first practicing this, I used to say, I'm really not sure how to convey this, but I really got this thinking feeling. I just want to share. Would you be open to hearing me? And they'd be like, oh, absolutely. I'd love to hear what you're thinking, because it breaks down the walls of projection. And we want to help people understand that I'm not projecting onto you. I'm really just trying to get to the bottom of this so that we can both have peace. And, you know, that piece, when somebody recognizes that's the type of personality you are, they will more default on the expectation that you're looking for a resolution versus control. And that goes back to that giving someone the benefit of the doubt. If you're a person who runs around with more cynicism and you know that you always have your guard up, to recognize that you're missing out on these opportunities to connect because of cynicism, or that critic, that inner critic, blocks you from really trying something different. So maybe an opportunity to play, like you were sharing with earlier, that you kind of like to be sarcastic. That expression is, as you know, is a repressed version of your true self. You know, the other man that wants to be seen and supported and loved. And that balance has to take place. It doesn't mean you get rid of your playful, cynic personality. It means that it evolves. It becomes more deep and more full of connection and joyful experiences. So it becomes more playful.
That's right. That's right. And it is vital to understand that we all have a lot to learn. I don't care who we are. I don't care what we're doing. There's ways to communicate with people around us that we need to learn how they communicate. We have to ask permission on whether we can share. We have to, you know, it's like, I like this whole sexual harassment thing, which is if I walk up and put my hand on your shoulder. Mm-hmm. Now, if we're talking about the 5 love languages, somebody says, hey, that's not my love language, take your hand off my shoulder. And if we didn't understand the 5 love languages, we might think they don't even like us, right? But if I walk up and put my hand on someone's shoulder, they might say, hey, that's physical affection and you've sexually harassed me. So it's all about understanding how the other person communicates. It's so vital that we start to understand. So we have to ask. You say, and so when I do teachings, a lot of times I say, would you mind if I put my hand on your shoulder? So if especially when I'm standing behind, I do computer instruction stuff. And so a lot of times when I walk up behind somebody, man or woman, I always kind of, it's okay if I touch you, because you touch their hand and you leaned over and you help them with their keyboard or whatever you're doing, but you have to ask permission. If you don't, you know, and that's all about understanding what they're feeling. Yeah. And so all those things, even in your communication with people that you know and you love, your mom and dad, right? You have to say, you know, Mom, is it okay if I share this? And you think, I shouldn't have to do that with my mom. Yes, you do.
Oh, especially your parents, especially family. It's so funny. I have learned that if we do not really give them a benefit, they remember from our past. They remember our past behaviors better than anybody. So they don't have as much space. I hate to say it that way, but much grace and space within communication, because they're going off past programming or past behaviors, and they're assuming you're already going down a path that you haven't even gotten to yet because of past patterning. So it's really understanding that it's not that they don't want to understand you. They just think that they've already been here with you. So they're going back into conditioning versus open communication. Especially with them, we need to be very mindful of asking for a new space, because they're not going to be naturally open to something different.
That's right.
So very fun.
Well, hey, before we wrap up, we'll wrap this part up, but Tamra and I were working on something, and part of that was I need to go into airplane mode in order to avoid some distractions. But the reason she couldn't get a hold of me earlier when we first started was because I was in airplane mode. And so I turned on my tablet over here, and I could see that she had sent me a message, but it didn't come through on airplane mode. So what I'm going to do to sign off on this is I'm going to put you on airplane mode and see if I disappear. How's that?
Sounds good. You see what happens.
See if I can get this done. I don't even know how to book. And I'll pull this out of here. And let's see.
Your phone doesn't work.
How do I find out?
You might not have wireless, and that's probably why it didn't work for you. We'll talk about that later. I'll help you.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, I went sideways, so either way. All right. Gotta go.
I'll help you with that later. You guys have a great day. Thank you so much for joining us Wednesday. Of course, we'll be here next week. And as always, have a wonderful, loving, connective week. And thanks again, Steve, for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.